That's what Jason Warren had decided 24 years ago when he erased Natasha Evans from his company. From his life. From his legacy. A single decision. A flick of a pen. And everything she had worked for was gone. She was supposed to disappear. But she didn't. And neither did the son she carried. Marcus Hayes grew up never knowing the truth, never knowing that the man who built an empire was the same man who tried to erase his existence. But fate has a way of bringing buried secrets to the surface. And when Marcus walked into Warren Enterprises as a rising attorney, he had no idea he was stepping into a battlefield designed to keep men like him out. He was never supposed to sit at that table. He was never supposed to shake that man's hand. But the past has sharp edges. And Jason Warren was about to learn that some ghosts don't stay buried. When Marcus uncovered the truth, when he realized his entire life had been a lie, there was no going back. He didn't want money. He didn't want apologies. He wanted justice. And when he took Jason Warren to court, when he exposed the corruption, the discrimination, the empire built on broken promises, the world was forced to watch as a man who had always been untouchable finally faced the consequences of his actions. What would you do if the man who destroyed your mother's life was the same man who controlled your future? Would you walk away? Or would you burn his empire to the ground? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. If you love stories of justice, power, and redemption, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Now, let's get into it. Marcus Hayes had always been a man who measured his steps carefully. He had learned early in life that the world had rules written and unwritten, and if a man like him wanted to move through it freely, he had to know both. He had spent years mastering them, bending them where he could, breaking them only when necessary. He was no fool. He knew what happened to men who miscalculated. That morning at the airport, he wasn't rushing. He had planned every minute down to the second his documents were in order. His carry-on was packed precisely to meet regulations. And he had left himself just enough time to get through security and make it to his gate. It was a routine he had perfected over a lifetime of business travel. Efficiency was his currency, and he spent it wisely. Yet, as he approached the TSA checkpoint, something in the air shifted. He could feel it before it happened. The way animals sense an oncoming storm. A ripple in the space around him. A tightening of the shoulders in the uniformed officer ahead. A glance exchanged between agents that lasted just a beat too long. He had seen this dance before. "Sir, step aside," came the voice, sharp and clipped, already carrying the weight of a decision that had been made long before Marcus had even entered the airport. He turned toward the agent, stocky, middle-aged, a name tag that read Willis, and met his gaze with a quiet steadiness. He wasn't one for theatrics. He wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to raise his voice. He had learned long ago that when men like Willis pulled men like Marcus aside, the game had already begun, and the rules would shift to suit whoever was in control. "Is there an issue?" Marcus asked, his voice even, measured. "Just a routine check," Willis said, motioning him toward a secondary screening area. Routine. The word had lost its meaning for Marcus long ago. He moved as directed, removing his belt, his shoes, his laptop, laying them out with the careful precision of a man who had done this before. He had walked into courtrooms where clients' lives hung in the balance with less tension in his shoulders than he felt now. He had faced judges with more kindness in their eyes than the officer who now rifled through his belongings as though he were searching for a reason to keep him from boarding his flight. Minutes ticked by. Other travelers breezed through security while Marcus stood, arms outstretched, as they patted him down once, twice, again. His briefcase, his laptop, his wallet, each item was inspected with a level of scrutiny that made his stomach turn. And then came the questions. "Where are you headed?" "Chicago." "What for?" "Work." "What kind of work?" "I'm an attorney." That answer always did something to men like Willis. A flicker of hesitation, a split-second pause before the act continued. Marcus knew what they expected him to be. "Not this." "A lawyer." "Huh?" Willis said, dragging the word out, as if trying to weigh its authenticity. Marcus didn't respond. He knew silence was more powerful than 1,000 justifications. He let the weight of it sit between them. Willis motioned for another agent. A young woman whose name tag read Tran. She hesitated before stepping closer, her eyes darting between Marcus and Willis. There was something in her expression, hesitation, maybe even discomfort, but she said nothing. "Run the bag again," Willis ordered. Marcus exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a steady stream. He could see where this was headed. And he didn't have time for it. "I need to get to my gate," he said, keeping his voice calm but firm. Willis didn't move. "You'll get there when we're done here." Marcus checked his watch. 28 minutes until departure. "I have a legal right to know why I'm being held up," he said. Willis smirked. "Legal right? That's funny." And there it was. The thing that lived beneath the surface of these interactions. The unspoken truth Marcus had felt pressing against his skin since he was old enough to understand how the world saw him. The quiet, lingering suggestion that his rights, his time, his personhood, none of it mattered in a space where men like Willis had the power to decide otherwise. Marcus clenched his jaw. He could feel the heat creeping up his neck. Not from fear, not even from anger, but from the familiar exhaustion that settled in when a man spent his whole life carrying the burden of other people's assumptions. He had two choices. He could let it happen. Let them make him miss his flight. Let them remind him that even a man with degrees, with a title, with a suit tailored to perfection was still, in their eyes, someone to be questioned, delayed, diminished. Or he could do what he had spent a lifetime teaching others to do, stand his ground. So he met Willis's gaze. Unflinching. "If you don't have probable cause, I need to be released immediately," he said, his voice quiet, deliberate, "or I'll be filing a complaint." A flicker of something crossed Willis's face, surprise. Maybe, or irritation, but he wasn't done playing yet. "I think we'll hold on to you a little longer," he said, voice dripping with mock authority. "See if anything else comes up." And just like that, Marcus knew. He wasn't getting on that flight. Not because he had done anything wrong. Not because they had found anything suspicious. But because they could. Because for some men, power was not about law, or order, or safety. It was about the satisfaction of making someone else bend. Marcus inhaled sharply, pressing his tongue against his teeth to keep himself from saying the things that wouldn't help him now. He glanced at Tran, who still hadn't spoken, who had watched everything unfold with the silent reluctance of someone who knew she should step in but wasn't ready to pay the cost of doing so. The intercom crackled overhead. "Final boarding call for Flight 378 to Chicago." Marcus closed his eyes. Just for a moment. He had lost this round. But he was not done playing. As Willis turned, satisfied, Marcus did the only thing he could do in that moment. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and hit record. "This is Marcus Hayes," he said, his voice steady as he turned the camera on himself. "I am being detained by TSA at Gate C-24 without cause. I am a civil rights attorney. And I will be filing a formal complaint against Officer Willis for unlawful racial profiling and obstruction of travel." Willis whipped around, his smirk fading as fast as it had appeared. And just like that, the game had changed. Because Marcus Hayes had learned something a long time ago. You don't win every battle. But the ones you lose? You make sure the world knows exactly why. Natasha Evans had learned a long time ago that silence could be just as loud as a scream. It was the sound of doors closing in her face. The absence of a voice on the other end of the phone. The stillness of an empty chair at the dinner table. Silence had weight. It pressed down on her shoulders, settled in the space between her ribs, and wrapped itself around her like an old coat she could never quite shed. She had been 22 when she first walked into Warren Enterprises. Bright-eyed and full of hope. Ready to take on the world. She was good, better than good. She had a mind that moved like a current. Sharp and fluid, quick enough to impress but steady enough to hold its ground. And she had something else. Something unteachable, a hunger. A need to prove that she was more than the circumstances she had been born into. That hunger had gotten her noticed. By him. Jason Warren had a way of making people feel seen. It wasn't the words he used, it was the way he delivered them. Slow and deliberate, as if he were letting you in on a secret. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and rearranged its gravity. People leaned in when he spoke. They wanted to be in his orbit. Natasha had been no different. She had not been naive. She knew the rules of power. The thin line between admiration and destruction. But for a moment, a handful of months that she had held onto like a lifeline, she had let herself believe that she was special. That she wasn't just another name on his list. That maybe, just maybe, she had rewritten the rules. And then she had told him. She had sat in his office, hands clenched in her lap, voice steady but small, and told him the truth. She was pregnant. Jason Warren had not raised his voice. He had not slammed his fists on the desk or cursed the way men sometimes did when confronted with a truth they did not want to hold. No, his weapon had been sharper, quieter. It had been in the way he leaned back, exhaled slowly, and said, "That's unfortunate." She remembered how the word had settled in the room like a stone dropping into a still pond. How it had rippled outward, distorting everything in its path. By the time she had returned to her desk, the process had already begun. The emails stopped coming. The projects she had led were reassigned. Her name was quietly erased from meetings she had once been essential to. It was subtle, methodical, an erasure that didn't leave bruises but cut just as deep. 2 weeks later, she was called into a restructuring, they said, budget cuts. They offered her a severance check and a sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. She had wanted to scream, to demand that they look her in the face and tell her the truth, that this wasn't about budgets or restructuring. That this was about Jason Warren's name, his legacy, his pristine, untouchable reputation. But she hadn't screamed. She had taken the check, walked out of that glass tower, and stepped into the kind of storm she had never prepared for. She remembered those first nights alone in her tiny apartment, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like an anchor. The rent was due, the fridge was empty, the world did not stop for a single mother-to-be. No matter how brilliant she had once been, she found work where she could. Temp jobs, waitressing, side hustles that barely paid the bills. She learned to survive on less sleep, to stretch $1 until it nearly tore. She traded ambition for necessity, dreams for diapers, boardrooms for midnight lullabies. And through it all, she never said his name. Not to the baby she carried. Not to the boy she would raise. Not to the reflection in the mirror that sometimes looked back at her with the hollow stare of a woman who had once believed she could be anything. Years passed, and Natasha rebuilt herself from the ground up. She got her degree in the stolen hours between shifts. She found work that used her mind again, that reminded her she was still the woman who had once walked into Warren Enterprises with fire in her bones. And she raised a son with Jason Warren's eyes and her determination. A son who watched her struggle and learned what resilience looked like. A son who grew up knowing that the world would not always be fair, but that he would never let it break him. Marcus Hayes had been the best thing she had ever done. And now, 24 years later, her past had come knocking. She had seen the name printed on the offer letter before Marcus had even shown it to her. Warren Enterprises. She had held the paper in her hands, fingers tightening around its edges, her heart beating in a rhythm she hadn't felt in decades. The silence of all those years cracked open like a fault line. And she had felt herself teetering on the edge of something she wasn't sure she could face. She had looked up at her son, this man she had raised. This man who had her fire and Jason's jawline, and she had seen the excitement in his eyes. He didn't know. He had no idea that the office he was about to walk into, the name he was about to work under, belonged to the man who had discarded them like an inconvenience. She could have told him then. She could have dropped the truth between them like a hammer and shattered the moment where he still believed this was just a job. Just another step in the career he had fought so hard to build. But she hadn't. Because how do you tell your son that the man he is about to work for is the same man who once looked you in the eyes and called him a mistake? So she had swallowed the truth, pushed down the nausea rolling in her stomach, and said, "Be careful." But now, as she watched Marcus walk out the door with the same confidence she had once carried into that building, she knew something with absolute certainty. The past does not stay buried. And Jason Warren was about to learn that for himself. The doors of Warren Enterprises opened with the kind of smooth efficiency that came with money. With power. With a carefully curated sense of exclusivity. Marcus Hayes stepped inside, feeling the shift in the air. The almost imperceptible weight of a space designed for men who believed the world bent to their will. He had walked into plenty of rooms like this, courtrooms where the marble floors carried the echoes of whispered deals. Conference halls where men in suits decided the fates of those they would never meet. He knew what this place was before he even stepped foot in it. It was not built for men like him. But that had never stopped him before. The receptionist greeted him with a professional smile, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "Mr. Hayes, welcome to Warren Enterprises. You're expected upstairs." There was no hesitation in her tone, but he saw it in her eyes, that brief flicker of evaluation. The half-second of calculation as she looked him over. It wasn't overt. It rarely was. But Marcus had spent a lifetime recognizing the quiet ways in which people were measured. Weighed, and more often than not dismissed. He nodded, polite but distant, and followed the security escort to the elevator. The ride-up was silent, except for the hum of the machinery and the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the enclosed space. He watched the numbers rise, felt the pressure shift in his ears, and let his mind settle into that focused space where he did his best work. He had prepared for this moment the way an attorney prepares for trial by knowing the players. The stakes, the history buried beneath the surface. What he hadn't prepared for was the name on the plaque outside the office he was about to walk into. Jason Warren. The name alone was enough to still Marcus's breath in his chest. Though his face remained unreadable. He had seen the name before, of course. On legal documents, on corporate filings, in headlines attached to billion-dollar acquisitions. But now, standing at the threshold of the office, it was different. This was not just a name. This was blood. This was history. This was the ghost of a past he had never been told. He pushed open the door. Jason Warren sat behind a desk so large it seemed absurd. A relic of a bygone era where power was measured in square footage. The man himself was an image of precision-tailored suit. Silvered hair combed back. The kind of posture that spoke of a life spent expecting obedience. He looked up, his expression neutral, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes when he saw Marcus. Recognition? Calculation? Mr. Hayes, Jason said, standing, offering a hand. His grip was firm, but Marcus had shaken hands with men like him before. A handshake meant nothing if the man offering it had already decided who you were. Mr. Warren, Marcus replied, his voice steady. He matched the handshake with practiced ease, not lingering a second longer than necessary. Welcome to Warren Enterprises, Jason continued, gesturing for him to sit. I've heard great things about you. Your reputation precedes you. Marcus sat, keeping his movements measured, his expression polite but unreadable. I appreciate that. He studied Jason, the way the older man's gaze flickered ever so slightly as he took Marcus in. As if he were searching for something, some thread of familiarity he couldn't quite place. You're here because we believe in investing in talent, Jason said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. Your work has been impressive. And we see a future for you here. We take pride in bringing in the best. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm sure you do. There was a pause, a small, almost imperceptible shift in the air between them. Jason steepled his fingers, his expression still composed. Tell me, Mr. Hayes, what do you know about Warren Enterprises? It was a test. Marcus knew that much. He could play the game. He could recite the history, the success stories, the sanitized version of Warren Enterprises that was meant to be admired. But he had no intention of playing by the rules Jason expected. I know Warren Enterprises has spent the last 3 decades building an empire, Marcus said, his voice calm, deliberate. I know it survived scandals, economic downturns, and a few close calls with the SEC. I know it has a reputation for ruthless efficiency and an ability to stay just inside the lines of legality when it suits the company's interests. He let the words settle for a beat before continuing. And I know that no company builds something this large without leaving behind a few bodies. Jason's expression didn't change, but there was a tightening at the corners of his mouth, a flicker in his eyes that Marcus caught instantly. A lesser man would have missed it. That's an interesting perspective, Jason said after a pause. It's a lawyer's perspective, Marcus replied. Silence stretched between them, a standoff without weapons, but a battle nonetheless. Jason leaned forward slightly, his voice measured. Do you always approach new opportunities with that level of scrutiny? Marcus tilted his head slightly. Only when the opportunity comes with a history worth examining. Jason held his gaze for a long moment before exhaling through his nose. Something that might have been amusement or irritation flickering across his face. I like you, Hayes. You ask the right questions. Marcus didn't smile. And I expect the right answers. Jason tapped a single finger against his desk, as if considering something deeper. I have a feeling you'll do well here. Marcus nodded, but in his chest, something cold and steady settled in. This was no ordinary job. This was a battlefield, and Jason Warren was a man who never entered a fight without knowing the outcome. And that meant one thing. Jason Warren did not yet understand who he was dealing with. Marcus stood, offering his hand once more. Jason took it, the grip just as firm, the smile just as rehearsed. "I look forward to seeing what you bring to the table," Jason said. Marcus met his gaze, unwavering. "Oh," he said, voice low and even, "I have a feeling you will." As he left the office, stepping back into the hallway, he exhaled slowly. The weight of his mother's warning echoed in his mind. Be careful. But careful was not what he had come here to be. He had come here to uncover the truth. And Jason Warren was about to learn that the past never stays buried. Some truths don't come quietly. They don't slip through the cracks, whispering their way into the light. No, some truths have to be dragged out, clawed from the depths where they've been buried, wrestled from the hands of men who have spent decades pretending they don't exist. Marcus Hayes knew this well. He had spent his career unearthing them, peeling back the layers of deception built carefully over years. But this truth, his truth, was different. It wasn't just another case, another client, another lawsuit that needed dissecting. It was personal, and personal truths had a way of making a man reckless. It started with a name he had never needed to question before. His own. Hayes. His mother's name, the only name he had ever known, the only one that had ever mattered. But that morning, sitting in his office at Warren Enterprises, staring at the company archives pulled up on his screen, he realized something unsettling. His name had always been half a story. And Warren, the name hanging over this empire, the name stitched into the very fabric of this building, was the other half. The moment had come unexpectedly. A simple research task that had spiraled into something much larger. He had wanted to understand the company's past. But instead, he had stumbled into his own. The archives were meticulous, a testament to Warren Enterprises' obsession with its own legacy. There were records of every deal, every acquisition, every legal case that had brushed against the company's name. And there, buried in the employment records from nearly 25 years ago, was hers, Natasha Evans. He didn't move, didn't blink. He read the entry once, then again, as if the words might rearrange themselves, as if the truth might decide to be less devastating on the second pass. But it didn't change. There it was, clear, clinical, written in the cold, detached language of corporate efficiency. Employment terminated. Reason: budget cuts. Marcus knew a lie when he saw one. And this was a lie. A search of internal memos led him deeper, to a series of correspondences marked confidential. Emails between executives, meeting notes, a quiet exchange of words, carefully curated to leave no loose ends. But there was one name that kept appearing. One name that sat at the center of it all. Jason Warren. Marcus inhaled sharply, pushing his chair back, the realization pressing down on him like a weight he hadn't expected to carry. He had worked for this man. He had sat across from him, shaken his hand, looked him in the eye. And Jason Warren had known exactly who he was. Anger simmered in his chest. But anger was easy. It was action that mattered. And if Jason Warren thought Marcus would play the obedient son silent, complicit, blind, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Marcus stood abruptly, grabbing his coat, his pulse hammering in his ears. He didn't need to think about where he was going. His body already knew. There was only one person who could confirm what he had just uncovered. Natasha Evans had never expected this moment to come. She had built an entire life on never looking back, on never letting the past dictate her future. She had learned the hard way that some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. But as she turned to find Marcus standing in her doorway, his face carved with an expression she had never seen before, not anger, not sadness, but something deeper, something unspoken, she knew. He knew. She exhaled slowly, setting down her coffee cup, bracing herself for a conversation she had spent 24 years avoiding. "Sit down, Marcus," she said softly. But he didn't sit. He couldn't. The truth had filled his veins with something electric, something restless, something that made it impossible to be still. "You worked at Warren Enterprises." His voice was level, but Natasha could hear the strain beneath it. She nodded. There was no point in denying it. "They fired you," he continued, his jaw tightening. "Because of him." She looked away then, toward the window, the city stretching out before her, the skyline jagged and infinite. She had always known this moment would come. But she had hoped she could outrun it, hoped she could protect him from it. But Marcus was no longer a child. Yes, she said finally. The word landed between them like a verdict. Marcus ran a hand over his face, as if trying to wipe away the past, as if trying to make sense of a history that had been kept from him. So it's true, he muttered. Jason Warren. He doesn't deserve that title. Natasha cut in, her voice sharp. A father is someone who shows up, who takes responsibility, who chooses to stand beside you even when it's hard. Jason Warren is just a man who made a choice. A selfish one. Marcus swallowed hard, his breath coming uneven now. The pieces of his life shifting, realigning, forming a picture he wasn't ready to see. All this time, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Natasha's gaze softened, because telling him would have meant making him carry the same weight she had carried alone for decades. Because she had wanted him to live free, not burdened by a name that had only ever brought her pain. I wanted you to have your own story, she said, not his. Marcus let out a slow breath, pacing now, the energy in his body too much to contain. Well, now I know, and I can't just, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I can't just do nothing. Natasha studied him carefully. She saw the fight in him, the fire that had always burned just beneath the surface. He was his mother's son, but he was also Jason Warren's. And that meant one thing. He would not let this go. Marcus, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Be careful. But he was already moving, already making up his mind, already stepping into a storm that had been waiting for him since the day he was born. Jason Warren had spent 2 decades pretending Marcus didn't exist. It was time to remind him exactly who he had tried to erase. Marcus Hayes had spent years perfecting the art of control. In the courtroom, in negotiations, in the quiet, measured way he carried himself through a world that always seemed to second-guess him. He had learned that power wasn't just in the words you spoke, it was in the pauses between them. In the way you held someone's gaze just a second longer than they expected. In the unshakable presence of a man who refused to be dismissed. But today, standing in front of Jason Warren's office door, that control was slipping through his fingers like sand. He could hear muffled voices inside, the low hum of power being wielded, the casual authority of a man who had spent decades unchallenged. The secretary had told him to wait, but waiting wasn't an option. Not today, not after what he had uncovered. Not after years of unanswered questions and an identity shaped by half-truths. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open and walked in. Jason Warren was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, mid-conversation with another executive, a man in a tailored suit who immediately went silent at the sight of Marcus. Jason looked up, and for the first time since they had met, Marcus saw it, the flicker of recognition. It was only a split second. A crack in the carefully composed expression of a man who had spent a lifetime controlling the narrative. But Marcus caught it, and suddenly, everything was different. Mr. Hayes, Jason said smoothly, leaning back in his chair as if this were just another business meeting. Another routine conversation. To what do I owe the pleasure? Marcus didn't sit. He didn't even acknowledge the other man in the room. His focus was singular. We need to talk. Alone. Jason's brow lifted slightly, the corner of his mouth tugging into something that wasn't quite a smile. I'm in the middle of something. Marcus didn't move. He didn't blink. Not anymore. A tense silence followed. Jason exhaled through his nose, his gaze steady, but Marcus saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. Jason Warren wasn't the type to be forced into anything, but he was also a man who knew when a fight wasn't worth the audience. He turned to the executive beside him and nodded toward the door. We'll finish this later. The man hesitated, glancing between them before gathering his papers and slipping out without a word. The door clicked shut, and now it was just them, the man who had built an empire and the son he had chosen to erase. Jason folded his hands on the desk, his expression cool. All right, you have my attention. Marcus stepped closer, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying the weight of everything. How long were you going to pretend? Jason's face didn't change. You'll have to be more specific. Marcus let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. You're really going to play dumb? Fine, let's make it easy. My mother, Natasha Evans. You remember her, don't you? For the first time, Jason's fingers twitched against the desk. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but Marcus had spent too much time in courtrooms, too many years studying body language, not to catch it. A tell. A sign that Jason Warren, the unshakable, untouchable mogul, was not as in control as he wanted to appear. Jason sighed, leaning back in his chair, his gaze shifting slightly not away, but inward, a man retracing steps he thought he'd left behind. I remember Natasha, he said finally, his voice measured. She was a talented employee. Marcus felt something in his chest tighten. Talented, he repeated, the word leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. That's the word you're going with? Jason exhaled sharply. Look, if you came here expecting some grand confession, you're going to be disappointed. Marcus took another step forward, the anger rising now, just beneath the surface, but still controlled, just enough to make Jason Warren uncomfortable. Just enough to make him feel even an ounce of what Natasha had felt all those years ago. You fired her, Marcus said, his voice quiet but unwavering. You erased her. And for what? Because she got pregnant? Because that didn't fit into your perfectly curated world? Jason's expression hardened, his jaw tightening for the briefest moment before he schooled it back into neutrality. I did what I had to do. Marcus felt the words hit him like a blow. The simplicity of them. The ease with which Jason Warren could dismiss everything. His mother's struggles. The years of working twice as hard for half as much. The nights of exhaustion. The sacrifice. The loneliness, all of it reduced to a single sentence. Jason continued, his voice cool, detached. You think you're the first person to come in here demanding answers? Looking for some kind of justice for the past? Life isn't fair, Mr. Hayes. It never has been. Marcus inhaled slowly, steadying himself. Refusing to let Jason dictate the terms of this conversation. You know what's funny? He said, shaking his head slightly. I thought this would feel different. I thought looking you in the eye, hearing you admit it, would give me something closure. Maybe, but all it does is remind me exactly what kind of man you are. Jason's lips pressed into a thin line. And what kind of man is that? Marcus leaned in, his voice low, firm, final. A coward. Jason's nostrils flared just slightly. But he didn't react otherwise. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. You built this empire, Marcus continued, motioning to the vast office around them. You shaped an entire company around your name. Your legacy. But here's the thing about legacies. Jason, you don't get to choose which parts of them last. Jason tilted his head slightly, watching Marcus the way a man watches a storm on the horizon, not afraid, but aware. You thought you could erase us, Marcus said. But I'm standing right here. And I'm not going anywhere. Jason's eyes darkened, his voice dropping to something lower, sharper. What exactly do you think you're going to do? Marcus? You're one man, and you work for me. Marcus let out a slow breath. Not for long. He smiled then, but there was something dangerous in it. Something Jason Warren had not been expecting. You know, you're right about one thing, Marcus said, turning toward the door. Life isn't fair. But here's the difference between you and me, I don't accept that. Jason didn't respond. He just watched as Marcus walked out of his office. Shoulders squared, purpose solidified. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Marcus Hayes had spent years preparing for fights like this, but never had one felt so deeply personal. In the courtroom, battles were waged with words, with precedent, with the quiet weight of carefully constructed arguments. But this was war. Not just for his mother. Not just for himself. But for everyone who had ever been cast aside. Silenced. Erased by men who thought they could shape the world with a flick of a pen and a well-placed phone call. Jason Warren had spent a lifetime making problems disappear. Marcus was about to make sure he never disappeared again. He sat in his office. The city stretched wide beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline painted in muted gold as the sun began its descent. On his desk, spread out in front of him like pieces on a chessboard, were the files. Warren Enterprises employment records, internal memos, archived HR reports, each one a breadcrumb leading back to the same undeniable truth. His mother had been fired under the guise of restructuring. But it was a lie. A convenient cover for a man who had made a choice and refused to face its consequences. And she wasn't the only one. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his fingers against his temple. He had seen patterns like this before, hidden in boardroom decisions, buried in corporate restructuring, disguised as business as usual. It was never about legality. It was about power. And when power dictated the rules, the law only mattered if someone was bold enough to challenge it. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. Ava Martinez answered on the second ring. Her voice sharp. No nonsense. Tell me you've got something. I've got more than something, Marcus said, tapping the files with his fingertips. I've got a case. Ava let out a low whistle. That's a hell of a statement. It's a hell of a situation. All right, break it down for me. Marcus inhaled slowly, grounding himself before speaking. Patterned discrimination. I found multiple cases, all tied together by the same method women let go under budget cuts or performance concerns right after reporting pregnancies. Most were quiet terminations, severance checks, NDA agreements signed under duress. Ava was silent for a moment, then exhaled. Jesus. Yeah, Warren? Warren. She didn't ask if he was sure. She didn't question the validity. That's what he liked about Ava. She trusted the work. She knew Marcus wouldn't bring something to her unless it was ironclad. All right, she said finally. What's the plan? Marcus stood, pacing the length of his office. We need a plaintiff, someone willing to go on record. Ava let out a dry laugh. And how many of these women do you think are ready to take on Jason Warren? They don't have to, Marcus said, stopping in his tracks. I will. Silence. Then Ava, in that sharp, assessing tone of hers, said, Are you out of your mind? I'm the only one who doesn't have a settlement to protect. Marcus replied, the only one who can't be bought out. Threatened. Erased. You sure about that? Marcus exhaled, staring out at the skyline. No, he wanted to say. Nothing is certain, but some fights, you take anyway. I know what I'm doing. He said instead. Ava sighed. I'm not sure whether you're fearless or just stupid. Probably both. All right, we need to move fast before they smell what's coming. If you file, this is going to explode. That's the point. A pause. Then, softer. You really think this is going to change anything? Marcus didn't answer right away. Change was slow. Change was brutal. Change was built on the backs of people who had been told they couldn't do things and did them anyway. But that wasn't the question Ava was really asking. Did he think Jason Warren would fall? No, not easily. Men like Jason Warren didn't crumble overnight. They had to be dismantled, piece by piece. I don't need to bring him down, Marcus said finally. I just need to make sure he can't ignore me. Ava exhaled through the phone. Long and slow. Then let's make sure we do it right. By morning, the lawsuit had been filed. By noon, the world knew. Headlines hit the internet like wildfire. Warren Enterprises accused of discrimination in new lawsuit. CEO Jason Warren faces legal action from former employee's son. Marcus Hayes, civil rights attorney, takes on corporate giant. Marcus sat at his desk, watching the notifications roll in, the buzz of his phone constant. His inbox was flooding, journalists requesting statements, former employees whispering in confidence, executives reaching out in quiet desperation to distance themselves from what was coming. The ground was shifting. And then, a single email. From Jason Warren. See me, now. Marcus exhaled slowly, a smile curling at the edges of his mouth. Checkmate. Marcus Hayes had walked into many rooms where he wasn't wanted. Courtrooms where judges barely concealed their skepticism. Boardrooms where executives assumed he was the junior associate, not the lead counsel. Conversations where his credentials were questioned before his arguments were even heard. But this was different. This time, he wasn't just walking into a room where he didn't belong. He was walking into a kingdom that was beginning to crumble. The office was quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that follows bad news. That lingers in the air like the last moments before a storm breaks open the sky. Warren Enterprises had spent decades projecting strength, power, certainty. But power built on fear had a flaw the moment people sensed weakness. They scattered like rats from a sinking ship. And today, Jason Warren's empire was starting to take on water. Marcus stepped off the elevator, his footsteps echoing against marble floors. His presence met with uneasy glances from employees who now knew his name not as a promising hire but as the man who had dared to challenge the king. There was a shift in the way they looked at him now, some with curiosity. Others with something close to admiration. Because here was a truth no one in this building would dare say out loud. Most of them had never liked Jason Warren. They had just feared him. And fear only worked if the person in power looked untouchable. The door to Warren's office was open. Not wide. Jason Warren never let anything sit wide open, but just enough to suggest that this meeting wasn't optional. Marcus stepped inside. Jason was standing near the window. the city skyline stretching behind him, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders squared in that perfectly composed posture of a man who was used to owning whatever space he occupied. He didn't turn right away. Instead, he let the silence settle. Let it stretch just long enough to remind Marcus that this was still his turf. But Marcus wasn't in the business of waiting. "You wanted to see me," Marcus said, his voice even, unshaken. Jason turned slowly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something Marcus hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't arrogance. It was calculation. The look of a man who had played every move in his head and had yet to find an exit that didn't end in blood. "I assume you're enjoying the chaos you've caused," Jason said finally, his voice calm, practiced. Marcus let out a slow breath, a half-smile curving his lips. "Chaos? No, Jason. That's what happens when you bury the truth for too long. It doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to rise." Jason's jaw tightened, just barely, before he exhaled through his nose and stepped toward his desk. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, placing his hands on the surface, his fingers pressing into the polished wood. "You think this lawsuit makes you the hero. You think you're standing up to the big bad villain. But you're playing a game you don't even understand yet." Marcus folded his arms across his chest. "Enlighten me." Jason gave a slow shake of his head, a small, almost pitying smile playing at the edges of his mouth. "This world," he said, motioning around the room, around the company, "doesn't reward idealism. It rewards control. It rewards winners. You think you're here because you fought your way in? No, Marcus. You're here because I let you in." Marcus arched a brow. "Is that what you tell yourself? That you allowed me to get this far?" Jason's smile faltered for just a second. He straightened, adjusting his suit jacket, smoothing his tie. "I built this empire," he said, voice lower now, quieter, "from the ground up. And you think you're going to tear it down with some lawsuit? Some accusations about things that happened decades ago? Do you know how many people have tried to bring me down? You think you're the first?" Marcus met his gaze head on, unmoved, unshaken. "I think I'm the first one you can't buy. And that's what scares you." For the first time, Jason Warren blinked, just once, but it was enough. He turned away, moving back toward the window, his shoulders a fraction tighter than before. "You don't understand how power works, Marcus. You think it's about truth, about what's fair, but it's not. It's about leverage. It's about what people are willing to risk. What are you willing to risk?" Marcus stepped forward. "I don't need leverage, Jason. I have something better. I have proof." Jason stilled. Marcus let the moment linger. Let him feel it. Let him taste the reality of what was coming. "I have documents, memos, testimonies from former employees, women who signed NDAs because they thought they had no choice. They thought you were untouchable. They thought they were alone. But they weren't, and neither was my mother." Jason turned then, slowly, and for the first time, Marcus saw something close to fear. He continued, his voice quieter now, but steady, like the tide pulling in. "Relentless. You built this empire on control, on making sure no one could challenge you. But here's the thing, Jason, the moment people stop fearing you, you stop being powerful, and you're not nearly as untouchable as you think." Jason stared at him, his expression unreadable, but Marcus felt the shift. It was in the way the older man's shoulders squared, the way his lips pressed together, the way he suddenly seemed to understand what he had never believed before. Marcus wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to end this. A long silence stretched between them. Then Jason exhaled slowly, almost thoughtfully. "So this is how it's going to be." Marcus nodded. "This is how it's going to be." Jason adjusted his cufflinks, his movements deliberate, controlled, but there was something else beneath it now. A weight he had never carried before. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice quiet. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Funny. That's exactly what my mother said about you." Jason didn't reply. Marcus turned, walking to the door, feeling the shift, the unraveling. Warren Enterprises wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a castle built on sand. And the tide was rolling in. As he stepped into the hallway, he saw the faces. Employees who had once looked at Jason Warren like he was untouchable. Now they looked at him like a man waiting for judgment. And Marcus? He just kept walking. Because this battle was already won. There are moments in life when the ground shifts beneath you. When the weight of years, of choices, of every untold truth crashes into the present with the force of an undeniable reckoning. Marcus Hayes stood at the courthouse steps, feeling the morning air press against his skin, watching the world move as if this were just another ordinary day. But it wasn't. Today, everything changed. Inside, reporters whispered into microphones, their voices urgent, their cameras pointed toward the towering entrance like it was the doorway to something sacred and unrelenting. Warren Enterprises versus Marcus Hayes. That was the headline, but that wasn't the real story. The real story was who would win when power was finally forced to look itself in the mirror. Marcus inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had prepared for this moment the way a man prepares for war, with precision, with strategy, with the unshakable knowledge that retreat was not an option. He wasn't here to settle. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to make sure Jason Warren never silenced another person again. The courtroom was packed. Executives from Warren Enterprises sat in stiff rows, their carefully curated appearances betraying no emotion. But Marcus saw the tension in their hands, the way fingers curled into fists beneath the polished oak tables. They were afraid, and they should be, because today, their silence, their complicity, their willingness to turn a blind eye, all of it was on trial. Jason Warren entered last. He walked with the same calculated posture, the same air of control, but his eyes told another story. Marcus had spent his life reading men like him, men who built empires and spent their waking hours terrified that someone, somewhere, would find the cracks in the foundation. And today, the cracks were too deep to ignore. The trial began, and the courtroom settled into the rhythm of law: opening statements, cross-examinations, evidence laid bare like bones picked clean. Marcus spoke with the precision of a man who knew the truth didn't need embellishment, it only needed to be heard. He presented the documents, the testimonies, the whispered confessions of former employees who had once been too afraid to speak. One voice alone might have been dismissed, but an entire choir of them? That was something no one could ignore. Jason's lawyers fought back with everything they had. They tried to bury the facts beneath legal jargon, under technicalities, under the weight of their own arrogance. But the truth was too loud. It had waited too long to be spoken. And then came the moment that changed everything. A woman stood. Not Marcus, not his legal team, but someone unexpected. Someone whose voice Jason Warren never thought he'd have to answer to. Natasha Evans. The courtroom hushed as she walked toward the stand, her steps slow but deliberate. Marcus had never seen his mother afraid. And today was no different. She took her seat, lifted her chin, and for the first time in 24 years, she spoke the truth in front of the man who had tried to erase her. I was 22, she began, her voice even, steady, unwavering. I worked hard. I was good at my job. And I trusted that hard work would be enough. She looked directly at Jason, her gaze unflinching. But it wasn't, because when I told the truth, when I told you I was pregnant, you decided I wasn't worth keeping. Jason's jaw tightened. His attorneys shifted uncomfortably. But Natasha wasn't finished. I raised my son alone. She continued, her voice stronger now. I worked 2 jobs. I fought to build a life. And I never asked you for anything. But you didn't just take away a paycheck. You took away my future in that company. You made a decision that forced me to start over when I had done nothing wrong. And you thought you could walk away from that. She leaned forward, her next words slicing through the room like a blade. But here's the thing, Jason, you didn't erase me. You didn't erase my son. And you sure as hell aren't going to erase this moment. The courtroom was silent. Jason Warren, for the first time, looked small. The judge spoke. The gavel struck. And just like that, history was written. Marcus stepped out into the daylight, his chest rising with a breath that felt lighter than any he had taken in years. Reporters rushed forward, microphones extended, voices overlapping. How does it feel to take down Jason Warren? What's next for you, Mr. Hayes? But Marcus wasn't thinking about Jason Warren anymore. He turned to his mother. Natasha stood beside him, watching the sky as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Maybe she had. Maybe they both had. Marcus took her hand, squeezed it gently. You okay? He asked. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that held decades of survival, of resilience, of a woman who had finally been heard. I am now, she said, and that was enough, because Jason Warren had lost. But more importantly, they had won.